join me in welcoming one of our own, Professor Naomi Adams.
Thank you. Thank you. It's so nice to be back. You guys have a lot of construction and things happening on campus. Things look a little different than they did when I graduated. I graduated in 2012 and immediately got a job and moved away to Idaho. So I came back for the queso today. Yep, that's true. All right, I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about my work today and about my process, because I think that's interesting as an artist, hearing about process and studios. Can you guys hear me in the back? Great. Okay, so I always like to start with this picture. It's amazing. It's amazing. I am the awkward girl in the blue dress with the smocking right there, the tallest daughter. My mom made everything in this picture. Like, she sewed literally everything. She smocked the dresses. She made my dad's tie. Like, she made everything. And so I come very honestly from a place of fibers. I just didn't know it when I got my undergrad in something else, right? But I came back around to it eventually. This is an awesome 80s shot in Decatur, Texas, okay? Okay, when I'm in the studio, I really love the process, and I really love checking off my list that a piece is actually done. So I'm one of those people that really likes both parts of the artistic and creative process. So I love these just buckets of dyed things, right? They make me really happy just to see that that's happening and to do it with my students. It's a really wonderful part of the process. So I'm going to show you some images of the way that things become increasingly handmade in my studio. As I learn how to make a new thing, then all of a sudden I'm making paper where I used to just buy the paper, or I'm dyeing fabric where I used to just buy the fabric. Okay. Before I came to graduate school, I was making art quilts that were two-dimensional. So this was a long time ago, it seems like to me. So that's where I kind of started before I came to UNT. This was my graduate studio at Bain Hall here at UNT a long time ago. Full of fabric and stuff and a big mess, right? Graduate school was wonderful. And I just like to show this because I like to see what's in other people's studios. Like, I love to look through their stuff and see what's on their wall. Okay, more stuff. I need a lot of things to make things with. Okay, this is my new studio that we just got reinstalled in my new house in Idaho. So it's like the whole half the basement. So this is a huge shot of it coming together again. It's always sad when your workspace becomes taken away from you. And I'm really happy when it comes back to me. So now it's all organized and it's all put together again. So I have a nice shiny green wall in the back. And that is a huge TV. That is not mine, right? I am marrying into a family where they have like 7 large TVs. I'm not kidding. So there's a large TV in every single room of the house where I listen to Netflix while I work. Okay, I'm also really invested in the idea of consistently making work, whether it's good or not, right? These are some little weekly art pieces I did before I came to graduate school, thinking about staying invested in the process and staying in my studio. So I'm not happy with the compositions of all of these, but it made sure that I was in my studio every week making something. Okay, so the work that I'm making right now, if I can step over here and not make the speaker squeal, I brought a little sample if you guys want to touch it or mess with it after I'm done. I'm making work that's soft, and it hangs on the wall, and it's made of items that would normally be hidden inside of a quilt. But I dye them and make other colors and patterns out of them. So this is the batting that I dyed. It's cotton, and I dye it in huge vats by hand, like squishing it over and over again with hot water, and I make a big pile of it. And then I was working on a design specifically for this piece. This piece hangs in City Hall here in Denton, actually. You guys could go see it. It's in a big plexiglass display case over in City Hall. But it was really responding to a poem that the poet laureate Carla Morton wrote. And so they asked for us to make pieces of work responding to her poetry. So this one is about one of the original trails here in Denton, Texas. So this is some stitching layers that I added as the kind of negative space on this piece. And so here's like my really obsessive thing that I do in my studio. So then I take all these little pieces and glue them with a little paintbrush while I'm listening to Netflix crime shows right now. Probably not the best, but I can't look at it and get distracted by it, so it has to be something really pretty terrible that I can just hear happening and I kind of know what's gonna happen. I'm like, yeah, that guy's gonna die. So I just keep gluing, right? And so I'm working on this in my studio, making these pieces and building up this texture. I was thinking about the landscape of Denton at a time when we didn't have UNT or all this civilization here. Okay, this is a side view. The pieces are about a few inches thick, right? It hangs on the wall and you can look at it from lots of different angles. Okay. I've also made work, my work is about relationships. And at this time, I was kind of struggling with a relationship, and I felt like I was saying things, and he was saying things, and nobody knew what anybody was saying, right? So I made this piece about text, and it's just gibberish, right? I feel like we say a lot of things, and sometimes people are listening, and sometimes they're not, and sometimes we can't even hear it through our filter. So this piece is called Envy. Then I made a bigger text piece, and I just want to show you the process of that. I actually needed to paint on matte medium to hold the letters in place so that it would actually stay glued archivally. Because I am worried about someone buying something and then it may be falling apart, right? I don't want it to fall apart. I want the consumer or the art collector to be really happy with their investment and their purchase. So this piece, I really made sure that everything was glued on tight. So Envy, for example, sits in my collection because I didn't feel like it was perfectly adhered. But this one went away and lives in another place now. It's called Greek because it's all Greek to me. Okay. This is another piece. This is looking at a traditional quilting design. So these are quilts, right? They're not quilts that other people think of as quilts. I sleep under an IKEA comforter, right? I didn't make the quilt that I sleep on under my bed, but I do make quilts that go on the wall. And so I was looking at a traditional pattern called Drunkard's Path, which is a great name for a quilting pattern, right? How did someone name something Drunkard's Path? And so then I extruded it into these other dimensions with these two colors. And there's one of my little nieces. That was at my MFA show. I showed this picture because relationships are important to me, not just the intimate ones that we have with our partners or our students or our colleagues, but also family, and thinking about how that plays in a role in our lives as artists. So she's one that I would take home with me to Idaho in a minute, but she won't go. She keeps refusing to get in the suitcase. And I have 10 nieces and nephews, so. This is another piece based off of a traditional quilt design of diamonds. And so they become popped into the third dimension there. And I'm thinking about transitions between time and how relationships change every day in my estimation, right? You think you have something worked out, everybody's good, and the next day everything's maybe not good, or something new happens and something happens in someone's lives and we have to kind of constantly reinvestigate what's happening between people. And so the idea is that as you walk past a piece, it looks this way as you look at it frontally, it looks this way from the side. It's constantly changing as you experience the piece. Okay. This piece is about my relationship with the environment, thinking about sustainability or not, right? I was dyeing all this fabric and all this batting and putting chemicals into the dye system, and so I started to kind of obsess over what am I doing. So this is the idea of looking at a river from an aerial view. It's called fluvial. Okay. So just a little bit more about the process. This is how I start in my studios. I make lots of samples. So as you guys are working in Design 2, you're looking at a lot of model making, right? You're not just sketching, right? You're looking at model making, trying things out in the 3D form. So I like to do that too because I never know how something's going to turn out until I actually physically make a bunch of samples and I decide what's good to me or what's bad or what's just boring. And so I made the sample with one layer of batting and it just looked a little thin and meh to me. So then I made some more and I looked at some analogous color play. Thinking about relationships and their relationship on the color wheel, just like we have people relationships, we have color relationships. So I looked at red, orange, and yellows and some screen printing, and I liked the sample more. So I decided to proceed with this one. And then I made lots of batting, and the orange went awkwardly when I made my dye calculations, so I had to dye the orange like 3 times to get it right. Okay, so then this became X because every time I wrote about it in my sketchbook and noted how many hours it was taking and what I was doing, I kept just writing an X instead of naming it, so it just became X because that's what the piece made. Because you see the X's in the middle of those squares. That's what it looked like to me. It was 60 by 60 when I made it. It's now 62 or 63 by 60 because the weight of it has stretched, because the magic of fibers is that it's malleable and stretchy and wonderful and not flat and precise. So now it's a lot bigger. That's screen printing on those inside pieces. Screen printing is a process where you're squishing paint, dye, other types of substrates through a screen in certain places and not in other places. So it's a beautiful way to make images on fabric or paper. And you guys can do that in the fibers department or the printmaking department here. And I like this one because it's so big that you can get engulfed in it. So then I made a piece to respond to that a couple years later, because then I wondered what would happen if I went from red, yellow, and orange to blue, yellow, and green, and looking at those pieces as kind of like a paired set. And I really like this one better, right? But I did make this one, and I made a lot of samples, and it's interesting. But I wanted to see what would happen if I made kind of like an opposite piece in cool colors instead of these warm colors. But I really like the response of the warm colors. Okay, so this is Harmony. And it's about 3 inches deep, so looking at that relief. Okay, this one is on the poster we have about my talk today. This one is called Complements. I really wanted to just look at a couple of complementary colors and thinking about the idea, are people better together, separate, paired against each other? Like what happens with people? Do they blend together when they combine and share experiences? Do they stay separate or do they affect each other? And I think they affect each other. So this piece was orange and blues. Okay. And then circle was just a basic exploration of a couple of different colors and thinking about the push and pull in relationships, right? What are we doing? Are we making things neutralize? Are we trying to work it out, or are we pushing against something or pulling something out of them? Okay. Giant stars based off of a quilt pattern, looking at the idea of 3 colors, and so thinking about all these differing reactions and lives. And I wanted to make a bigger one, so this one's a little bigger, 42 by 56. Bigger for me. Okay, this is the one that I just got off my table before I moved my studio this summer. It's called Mask. I've been looking at a lot of mask designs from many indigenous cultures. We have lots of ways that people protected themselves in war and other places, and sometimes I feel like academia is a war. I'm fighting a battle, and so this is looking at how do we protect ourselves, what are we showing people, what are we letting through, what escapes, right? What kind of boundaries do we put up, and what happens between people. So I think you can see a mask design in this. If you look at it, there's some eyebrows and some like shapes and eye faces. And it's accidentally Halloween colors. I knew it was gonna be, but I'm okay with that. This one is called Kindred. I made this one last year, also looking at mask designs and patterning, thinking about the calm that can come together when people work together. Okay, I'm going to show you a couple of pieces of 2D work that I'm also working on. So this piece is digitally designed fabric. So we have amazing technologies now that are not going away. We just got a 3D printer at my school. I know that the fibers department has some like amazing new printing technologies. So there are systems now where you can just pop a design into Photoshop or Illustrator, send it to someone, and they print it on fabric for you. And it's just completely amazing and transformative for a lot of people. So this piece, I wanted to explore that. And so the images that you can see on the top right and the top left are from some images of mushrooms that I was taking pictures of really close up. And then I altered it and dyed it. The piece on the bottom is a shibori piece that I dyed. The strip in the middle with all the lines on it is actually images of books that I scanned, right? My handmade books. I scanned them in and wanted to get that linear, kind of symmetrical quality. And then I dyed a lot of stuff. And then I made these little like wiggly like worm designs. Those gray pieces are stamps that I cut. And then I also appliqued the black images over on top. So I was looking at thinking about like what happens with mushrooms and growth, and then really explore these digital technologies and just kind of get my foot in there and make a piece that looked at what are all the things that we can do. And this isn't even anything about what we can do with digital technology and fabric. This is just a bit of it where I was trying to play with it. So we have Wacom tablets now, right? You can just draw designs, send them in, and make fabric just from your drawings, which I think is an amazing thing to celebrate. Okay, here's a close-up of that. So I stitch it on a machine. I don't hand stitch them because then I wouldn't get anything done, right? I love hand stitching and it's so contemplative and wonderful, but I need to finish work and move on to the next thing really desperately for my own brain's happiness. So I use a machine. So this is actually my grandmother's machine that she gave me. She was a seamstress, and so I'm using her machine to stitch these lines on. Okay. This piece I made as soon as I moved to Idaho. So they had a call for a show that was talking about how text messaging has changed our existence, right? I grew up in a time where there were no text messages when I was a teenager or a young adult, and then that has become a part of my life. And so this image is about how I've stayed connected to my family and friends and connections that I've made through text messaging. So you can't see it really well here. I'll show you a detail. All the white stuff is images, it's paint, and they're images of texts that I've received or sent my sisters or my best friend. And there are crazy things in there, right? Like, what is it that is so important that we're capturing, right? And these like small, intimate details of text messages. There's definitely a whole sentence that just said, I went to the grocery store and I forgot to buy sparkling water. Oh no, right? Like that was like the end of the world. And I really love that that's captured in something that could last for a long time if I so chose, right? This piece could be there forever when these text messages are fleeting. And if my phone breaks, they all just disappear into some mysterious place and I'm never gonna get them back again, right? But those connections to me are important, and I feel like they are permanent, the connections we've made. So the idea behind this is it's based off of a cell tower design, right? That's the red lines. And then I was looking at all these circles about tying us together. I started with a whole piece of fabric, and that's it. All I've done is taken one piece of fabric and then dyed it. I soy batik printed it. I dyed it again. I screen printed the white letters on there. I screen printed the circles. I did like 7 processes to try to make this one piece of fabric tell this story. So it's called Threads. I used some really thick thread on there, the idea of binding us together as human beings. And the fact that I can stay connected to people that are hours and hours away, just like through my phone that I carry in my bag. I'm also an artist bookmaker. If you guys don't know what an artist book, it could be a lot of things. You guys have the opportunity to make artist books on this campus through the printmaking department. Okay? And I really fell in love with a technology that we have, which is called letterpress printing. And so at my new school, we have a letterpress lab, and then I'm in charge of the fibers lab and the papermaking lab. And so when you have access to these things and you take advantage of them, I feel like your work can change, right? So my work has changed because I have access to all these cool things that are sitting right there. And I'm thinking about how to solve a creative problem, and then I think, well, I could go make something to solve that problem. So I do. So this piece was created here in Denton at the Texas Women's University Letterpress Lab. And letterpress is the imaging that you can see in the large gray letters. So that page says coupling, and this page says 2 to tango. So this piece, I was struggling through a rough divorce, quite honestly. And what I was looking at is thinking about what happens if you were together with someone for a really long time. For me, that was like 15 plus years. And then what happens? Are you the wine bottle standing alone? Are you the cheese that stands alone? Those things we expect to go together, and then all of a sudden they're apart and separated. So I cut a hole in the bottles to look at those ideas overlaid on each other, and then I used common sentences because it seemed as I looked around the world, everybody was paired up with somebody, right? Which is obviously isn't true, but that's what I saw in my like crazy divorce filter, right? So I kept thinking like all these sayings, right? 2 to tango, coupled, all these like wonderful phrases that seem positive. And so if you look at these guys, they're just different images of wine and cheese together or apart. So I printed the words on the letterpress, which is an old, beautiful technology, and you guys have several over in printmaking. And those are wood type letters that have been around for ages. And then I hand drew the wine bottles on there, and I watercolored the images on top to give them some color. And I made an edition of 6. So that means I made 6 of these, right? So I processed 6 books, and so they're all slightly different. So they're an edition varié, which means they're just a variable edition. So they're all very similar, but since I hand drew them, they're not exactly the same, right? And then I bound them into a book. Okay, so here's an image of those in process. So those are the letterpress images, the 2 peas in a pod images up top, before I had carefully chopped the holes out of them and bound them into these other book structures right in front of you. So I also letterpressed the cover because I thought that was a nice moment. You want to tell people often with an artist book which is the front and which is the back. So that's a way to do it, is to put the title on the front. So when I was making this book, I didn't realize it was going to become a tradition for me to cut holes in books, but apparently it was. So the holes have gotten harder after this, so stay tuned. When I left grad school, I really wanted to do something shiny, apparently. So as I look back now, why did I make so many shiny things? This was a really shiny book. So I made this book in 2013 with a lot of luminescent paints and a lot of things. I think I was looking for some sun in Idaho. So all of a sudden, I got transported to this place with long winters. And so I was in my studio looking at all the snow outside for months at a time, trying to figure out how to brighten it up. So I made some shiny work. Okay, this is layers of paint, textile paints, stitching, collaged papers on a substrate, and then quilted. And then I stitched the edge with hand-dyed thread with the Coptic stitch binding, which is an old binding from the Copts. So we're using technologies from a long time ago. Okay, I made this edition. This was my first edition in graduate school. Again, I just want to show it to you because it's cutting things up and reassembling. So I have this tradition of cutting things up and reassembling. Even with artist books, I'm constantly piecing together the pieces of my life and reassembling them. So this was about my best friend in Austin, Texas, and we used to always go and drink Mexican martinis at Chewy's, and that was our thing. So I made a book for her about the layers of all the ingredients on a different page of the accordion. And you put them on transparencies, and as you layer them together, you can see the whole image. Or if you separate them out, you just see portions of them. So again, thinking of people as together, separate, or apart. And there it is. As you lay them on top of each other, you can see the whole recipe or image come together in completion. Okay. And they're about the size of a recipe card, right? I was thinking about all the things that have to do with making food in a kitchen. And the idea is that food is what a lot of relationships are built on, right? You call a friend to go eat something, right? You eat with your family for Sunday dinner. And so thinking about those things as really positive aspects of our lives. Okay, and there's the making of that one in my studio. So you make books in a series all at once, right? So you have to do everything at once and then do the next step all at once. And I was terrified that I was going to mess up the order of the pages, because I definitely was. And so I made a whole poster that I had taped in my studio on the back of one of Amy's print tables. Sorry, Amy. I have it taped on the back there, and it lists what goes on which page, where it goes in order, and I had them all set out so that I didn't mess it up, because I wanted them to all be the same. Okay. This piece is about, at the time I had 9 nieces and nephews, and I had to make a book before there were 10. Because this book is made in divisions or multiples of 3s, okay? So a flag book, it works in like segments of 3. You need 3 flags on each segment or page. So I had to quickly make it before Miles was born, and he's left out of this one. So I need to make another one that includes the whole set of 10. So this one is based off any fibers department, like the one I went to, has stacks of old wool samples, thread samples. This is how we used to get samples, right? We used to send away for a sample, and it came to us in the snail mail. And it was all these crazy yarns and threads labeled with like typewriters and all these crazy things. And you just find drawers of them that smell weird and feel strange and have all these like weird writings on them. And you don't even know if they make that thread or fabric or fiber anymore. So I was thinking about my nieces and nephews as little samples of their future selves. And so I interviewed all of them, and I included their birth dates. And each flag is the set of their favorite colors at that time on that day. And so I made a little flag for each one of them as their little sample of their future self. And one of them was really into Dora at the time, so one of them is like all Dora the Explorer colors, right? One of them is like all starting to be black and grays. It was one of my nephews, and he was like getting older, and he's like, I love gray and black. And I'm like, buddy, really? That's what we're doing? Yeah, so I made this flag book in representation of them because they're an important part of my life. So we're gonna see what they turn out to be when they get bigger, but for now, that moment in time is captured by them. So I made it on my grandmother's typewriter. So I typed her images on this handmade paper and stitched it all together. Okay. I made this edition recently trying to make a book out of one page of paper, right? So I was looking at making a book out of just a single sheet of paper, like I make work sometimes out of a single piece of fabric. So thinking about how far can you push just one piece of paper. So this was about all the ceramics that I have acquired. It's a really wonderful moment for me to get up in the morning and have a cup of coffee and a mug by someone I've met or known or interacted with, right? So that person then imbues their personality into that handmade ceramic. It's a functional wear, and then I get to use it in my kitchen. And so this is just kind of a documentation of the days of the week with those coffee mugs, thinking about how much joy that's brought me. And that green one actually is broken since then, right? And so like using them and knowing that they might get destroyed in the dishwasher if I get distracted and drop it. So looking at those things and the joy that they bring me in my life. So I made an edition of 7 for the days of the week. So I made the edition relate to the days of the week. The paper is handmade, and I took all the bits of coffee ephemera that I could find. So I took like coffee sleeves and like coffee grounds and coffee filters and put them all in the beater and beat them up together to make that handmade paper. So that's why it has that nice color. Okay. I'm going to do this as a plug for Drawing One. Okay? If you guys aren't using your sketchbook, you should be, right? Every day. You should be working in your sketchbook. It's a great place for your brain. So it's a great place for your brain to rest, to doodle, to do something maybe seemingly not important that you can refer to later. So in my studio, I have a whole just shelf of sketchbooks. And so when I need to go back and find something, or I feel like I'm just staring at a blank white wall, and I don't know where to go, I just pull out a sketchbook and all of a sudden I'm in the zone again, right? It's right there, I've drawn a billion things. So Rachel Black was doing at the time a 100 drawings of motif drawings of the same item over and over again all semester. So I decided to do it along with my students. And so I decided to draw the things that I saw in my studio. So I handmade this book, or this journal, and I started just drawing what I saw in front of me. So that's just like an image transfer up at the top left of a crazy like fishing diagram that I found in a book that was really fascinating. I transferred it using Citrusol, right? Just really easy, and I just transferred it to the paper, and then I just started drawing in ink. All the different things I found. And I think sketchbooks are more fun when you paste stuff in them and put weird paper in them. So this one is just some patterns and buttons I found in my studio. Watercolor tubes and more buttons. And you see that the edges are deckled. I love the natural idea of the paper that came out of the vat and someone cooched it onto a felt, and then they're drying it and then using that paper that they made from scratch. And then my mom keeps sending me boxes of maps. I need to tell her to stop. So she keeps sending me maps, so I have to include them somehow. Okay. I needed some Earl Grey tea to survive graduate school, right? We have some tea pens for screen printing, tape. So I encourage you guys to sketch and use that as an opportunity to be at peace and do something really quiet and introspective, right? Sit quietly with your sketchbook each week. Okay. So then I got interested in vintage books, right? And being able to take vintage books that people are throwing away. So thinking of sustainability, now I'm always keeping an eye out for library book sales, because what happens after library book sales is they just recycle those books. I'm sad to tell you, right? And recycling is not the best way to reuse them. We can reuse them in better ways than that as artists, right? I encourage you guys to find a book and do something cool with it. So I took these 4 books for a show at Aeromont, a year that I taught there during the summer, and I repurposed the covers into new journals, right? So they got to live new lives and go and imbue somebody else's life with some pleasure. Okay, so here's my stack of vintage books right now. I took a picture for a friend that likes everything organized by color. So I just keep collecting them, and I really have too many built up that I now need to use. So that means I'm in trouble, and I need to really make some more books from those. Here's another one I did for a friend. I traded this one for some ceramics work. She really loves Alice in Wonderland, so I made her a book about Alice. So sometimes objects can be just functional, right? Like I gave this to her and she's gonna fill it up with all sorts of drawings and other sketches. Okay, this one I made for one of my nephews who is a smart aleck, quite honestly. We were standing outside one day and he was maybe 7 at the time and he's like, oh look at the moon phases. Hey Naomi, do you remember which one that is? And I'm like, no. And he's like, what do you mean you don't remember? And I'm like, I learned that like 20 years ago maybe. I don't remember what moon phase that is. And he's like, well, I'm disappointed. And he walked away. So I was shamed into making this book for him, right? I was so embarrassed that he thought that I was not smart. Like he was just disappointed in me. So what I did is I found a book about the moon phases and then I put fabric all around it. So the book is hiding in all of those cutouts, right? So it's called an altered book when you do that. So I took it and I covered it up and looking at the idea of moon phases, and I collaged all these different moon patterns on there and diagrams of the phases. So now I will never forget what those are called. I am like sure that I can remember it for the rest of my life. So this one was from Martin. Smart aleck nephew. My shame book. Okay. Thinking more about sustainability. The practice of dyes and synthetic dyes, I love these synthetic dyes, right? They are so bright and so colorful and color fast and wonderful, but they're probably not that great for our environment, right? They're getting into the water stream and doing all sorts of things. So as I moved to Idaho and I had an increasingly large number of students that were pregnant because of the community that I live in, I started looking at alternative ways for students to do dye work. So we started bringing in natural plant dyes in every project, which are a much more sustainable and less toxic way to work. And so then as I was doing that, I started to think about the relationship between all these cool things that we eat, and then we can dye things with, and then we can dye our clothes with, and like just these beautiful layers of connectivity. So I made this book about that. So I took 4 dye colors, if I can remember them, mint, cilantro, thyme, and then one other one, anise or fennel, because I wanted the colors that I liked and the herbs that I would choose on a desert island, right? So I play weird games with my friends like desert island herbs. Which ones would you keep, right? If you could only keep 3 herbs in the world, what would they be, right? What would you cook? Is it Italian food? Is it Tex-Mex? What is it? So I made this book thinking about those. So the colors on the left are the actual colors that those herbs make, right? So blues, greens, yellows. And then I screen printed some leaves in the middle. And then I also put all these ideas, thinking about my nieces and nephews as samples, is the way I think about herbs and food as samples. I love to read a recipe and not know how it's gonna taste, right? I have this idea of what it might be, but until you actually make it and follow somebody else's crazy like little roadmap of a recipe, you don't know what's gonna happen. So I made this accordion with more holes cut out. I told you there were more holes coming in a very complicated way, and I'm not sure exactly why I chose to be so hard on myself. It's an edition of 16. So I made a tunnel accordion so I could see all the different colors at once. Then I could see how they all interlaid, like all the flavors in a recipe interlay. And kind of celebrating this idea of herbs and food. And then the letters are letterpress printed. I made the paper on the front of the cover with herbs in it. And so I will never live it down. I actually crushed a piece of type in the letterpress shop. So I left a piece of fennel in there that was too big, and my colleague is never gonna let me live it down. Just last week, she's like, you're not gonna put any more herbs in paper, right? Are we clear on that? We're not doing that, right? So I crushed a piece of wood type, which I'm never gonna live down. But there are beautiful herbs in there. They don't smell good still, but it's still in there and you can see it. Okay, so that's that one. This last book is a piece I made at a residency 2 summers ago. So in 2015. So as I keep worrying about politics and everything I see on my news feed every day, and I think about how this affects my life, I decided to make a book about mutualism, because I think animals have done a much better job of keeping it together than maybe humans have. And so I was looking at the idea of animals and plants that have worked together to survive. So thinking about acacia trees and ants working together to survive, or clownfish and anemone, right? So thinking about these connections and how they work together to really make the world a better place. And so I made this book about mutualism called Community. And it is letterpress printed and pressure printed. I made it at the Kimmel Harding Nelson Center for the Arts in Nebraska. And I furiously printed all those pages while I was there, and then I had to come back home to bind them. So it's an edition of 14, but looking at the symbolism of those things together. And then the yellow lines that are printed on there are the ideas that I looked at all these diagrams about mutualism, trying to understand this really scientific thing and not make a mess of it and misrepresent it as an artist. But I kept seeing all these cool diagrams with like all these stitching lines from one object to another and all these circles of life. And I really loved those stitching lines, so I included those on the back pages. Okay, I just want to show you this last piece that I just made last month. So I handmade this bamboo paper. I didn't grow this bamboo, but we are growing things in Idaho, like our own indigo and some other cool things there. But I made this bamboo from some pre-processed stock that I purchased. And I made this paper with maps in it. And then I took a lot of ink. And then I set up the type. So this is what the type looks like on a letterpress before you print it. You set it backwards and upside down. And I wanted to make this piece for a show we were doing in my hometown. I'm sorry, in the town I live in now. That was a misstep, right? This is my hometown. In Pocatello, Idaho, and this is a poem that my dad wrote called Kite Flying in Fall. My dad just retired, and he was a mechanical engineer for his whole career, but he also has a degree in poetry. And I think that he writes poetry like an engineer, which I think is fascinating. And I think I make work like the daughter of a really sassy mom and a very mechanical and creative dad, right? So I think that all these things affect us as our artistic genealogy. So I wanted to make this broadside for him on this handmade paper. And it's about my grandma and how intense she was and how he got her to step away one day and go watch the kites. So I made it on handmade paper, and I hand drew these images with a micron pen of box kite diagrams, thinking about my dad and how he constructs things and how his brain works, looking at it from an engineer. And so you can see the little bits of writing in the paper. Right by the yes, yes, you can see the little bits of handmade paper stuck in there as an inclusion. Okay, you guys have questions? Yes, James.
I was wondering where Killer Bee Designs as the name of your studio came from.
That's a great question. I keep that attached to my work because when I was unhappy, I was working in the nonprofit industry, and I loved the work, but I wasn't getting any creative outlet. So I was working in nonprofits and furiously making things at night. And so I thought before I came back to grad school, I was like, well, maybe I should just sell stuff that I make, right? But then, so I made myself a name called Killer Bee Designs, thinking about quilting bees, and killer bees as a play off of like quilting. And I wanted it to be harder core than quilting. So Killer Bee Designs, like really mean killer bees, right? Like I wanted it to be really edgy. And then I realized that production work is not something I enjoy unless it's a small edition like this, and I've designed everything and created it. I realized that I didn't want to make 17,000 cup holders for clients, right? Like that was not something I wanted to do. I wanted to be an artist and make things and work on it from that side. So that's how Killer Bee Designs came through. What else? Yeah?
The petals that you put of the quilted material,
Yeah.
did you sew each one of those on?
I tried that and it didn't work. They were too floppy and wiggly for me. I wanted them to be really precise and like little soldiers. So I used 2 types of glue. So the back piece, I quilt all this stuff. I make these sheets of batting. I cut them into shapes. And then I paint matte medium on the back and let it dry. And that's pretty toxic, so you shouldn't smell that. So let that dry when you're not smelling it, right? And then I take each little piece and I paint another acid-free glue on the edges. And then I hold them down and look at the crime show for a minute. And then I look back, and then I let go, and then I cut another one and glue it again. Yeah, it's true. I do it, James. You know that I do. And I'm so ashamed about how many crime shows I've seen in the last few years. Netflix thinks all I do is sit around and watch crime shows. They are really concerned about my mental sanity. Yeah. What else? Yeah?
How has your work changed since you moved?
Absolutely. It's changing right now. So I just gave my tenure box away to the committee last month. And so this is my 5th year at Idaho State, I've been trying to produce an exhibit and show as much as I possibly can right? Just sleep only whenever absolutely necessary. So now that that's almost over, right, I'm thinking about really big paper installations and really kind of like risky things that I can do, thinking about letting that pressure valve off just like a tiny bit. So I'm making handmade paper samples in connection to that, trying to think about how I could alter a specific space with some handmade paper objects, right? But I do think that it's changed because of the facilities that I have. So if you guys go get residencies where you learn a new process, you learn a new technique, then you can incorporate that into your work, and that has definitely changed. The handmade paper, I wouldn't be making unless I had a top-of-the-line studio to do it in. I would find it too frustrating or time-consuming right now. So I do it because I have access to those resources. What else?
In these threads, I noticed that all the threads that are on the surface are multiple colors. Did you change oh wow.
Yeah,
Each time?
absolutely. Because when I talk to quilters about color theory, the threads are pieces that are very much part of the work. And for me, they're very much part of like stitching the world together, stitching myself to other people, right? Thinking about mending, darning, fixing. And so I change the thread colors a lot because that changes the effect of the pieces a lot. Yeah. And I have started hand dyeing my thread too since I moved to Idaho. So there's a lot of things that have happened that I've started doing because then I can really control everything. Yeah. What else? Yeah?
On your three-dimensional quilts,
Yes.
do you bind the edges of them, or do you allow the batting to show around the edges, kind of like you do?
We had that conversation a lot in grad school, like what in the world am I supposed to do with this non-traditional quilt and all these edges? So I just leave them raw. I just stitch the edges a little, but they just fray, and every now and again I'll just go rip some pieces off and tidy it up with some scissors. Like I just don't worry about it because I want you to see what happened there, right? I want you to see that color because the idea is that I'm showing you parts of me and hiding other parts of me that are hiding behind here. You don't actually know what's behind there. It could be not dyed, right? It is, I'll tell you that. But I mean, it could not be dyed, right? So I want you to see some glimpses, but I'm not gonna show you everything, right? What else? Yeah, Amy.
Did you show the quilt show in Houston?
I got kicked out of that show. I got a new rule. I got a new rule made for me. So the quilting industry is very specific. And so when I came to grad school, I thought I should be maybe part of that world. And now I've realized that that's not a world that wants to change, right, necessarily. We have new modern quilters that are amazing, and that's wonderful, and they're doing a whole separate thing, but still not pushing the boundaries. So I sent a piece to the show, those three-dimensional. They gave me a huge prize and a lot of money, and then they said, don't ever come back here again. And they made a new rule, number 9B, that says we will absolutely not take three-dimensional work. If you can't roll it, squish it, hurt it, like we're not taking it, and you can't give it to us. We're not gonna show it. So I effectively was an activist, and I didn't even know it. So there you go. So I encourage you guys to get new rules made for you. Yeah. Yeah, they can't be, I mean, I found that they actually can be squished a little, and eventually they'll like come back to life. But if you roll this, it's gonna get crushed and hurt. So I actually try to keep them taut. I hang them, I ship them, which is a whole different artist conversation. I ship them in large boxes to FedEx, and I have to suspend them and protect them in big plastic bags and make sure they don't get cracked or smushed in the process. Yeah. Straddling both worlds. I'm just not just a quilter. I'm an artist, and I've accepted that. So I show in fiber shows, right, that are accepting of all the crazy things that fiber people do, which are wonderful. Okay, maybe one more question, and then I think we'll have to stop. Yes?
How did you begin work in fiber? Did you just, at a young age, jump into it, or did you do research?
Yeah, I started, my mom would throw her scraps. She made all of our clothes growing up, like I showed you that picture. She would just throw the scraps on the ground, which is probably why I do that in my studio. I just realized that. So I just throw everything I don't want on the floor. And so she'd throw all the scraps on the ground, and we'd sew them on our Barbies and not even play with our Barbies and rip them off and then make another piece, right? My sisters and I just obsessively made fashion designs. So I got a degree in interior design as my undergrad, and I started working in that industry, and I was not enthralled with just picking fabrics for other people's chairs. And so then I started making quilts in my own time, and then today I'm here making all sorts of crazy stuff, right? And books came along because I had access to them here at UNT. And I just love artist books and the narrative you can tell with them. All right, thanks guys.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.